Hi everyone, this is Cherice Montgomery, and today we're going to be talking about scaffolding across the three modes of communication. This particular session is going to be focused on interpretive communication. And by the time we're finished, hopefully you'll be able to define and describe scaffolding, identify places where a text needs scaffolding, and select appropriate scaffolding strategies. As we've talked about before, when we are thinking about high-quality, gold standard project-based language learning, we're trying to move from projects that don't require very much target language use or cultural knowledge to projects that actively engage students in using the target language and culture because they are essential to the completion of the project. In other words, in project-based language learning, our goal is to get learners to create with language in real-world settings for authentic audiences and purposes. Now, the giant issue for most language teachers is that their first thought is that my students don't know enough language to do that in the real world. And I think that we tend as language teachers to think about language use in terms of linguistic Legos. So we're going to use this analogy, and I want to credit Ani Case for the concept. So the idea is that we tend to think of language use as a bottom-up process, where we start by giving them the letters or the sounds, and then they progressively build words from there. And then we say, well, our learners need a lot more grammar and vocabulary before they can accomplish this. But I would suggest that actually we're focusing on the wrong thing, that a lot of what enables language use has very little to do with the language itself. And if we look at the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, one of the things that we can see, and I'm going to let you explore this on your own later, is that high levels of proficiency actually require that students have opportunities to explore authentic contexts, to have something to talk about, or in other words, real life content, and they require substantive amounts of critical thinking. So I would posit that in order for a language learner to be successful in communicating, one of the primary things that we have to scaffold is the critical thinking and the content. And so as we're thinking about exploring social problems or eliciting cultural comparisons or helping students to experience disciplinary content or engaging them in critical thinking, we need to be looking for ways to give them bite-sized chunks of those things, bite-sized chunks of complexity. And this does not mean that we have to teach a whole bunch of additional stuff. What it means is that we are looking for ways to layer what we are teaching so that learners have opportunities to play with the language and the culture and to experiment, and that they are given the support that they need to think through those tasks. So what is it that we need to scaffold? Well, first of all, project-based language learning essentially consists of three major issues. Students have to acquire information through interpretive inquiry. They have to be able to process and apply that information, which requires cognitive engagement, and that usually occurs through interpersonal communication. And then they need to be able to share what they've learned. So what we're scaffolding in these three phases is the comprehension, the cognitive engagement and task completion, and the linguistic output. So what do we mean by scaffolding? When we think about scaffolding in terms of constructing a building, scaffolding is all of this stuff on the outside of the building that enables the workers to move from one level of the building to the next before we have the elevators and stairs and those kinds of things in place. So the scaffolding provides support as we're constructing the building. The same thing is true for language learners. We can think of scaffolding as a bridge that helps learners to cross what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development, he says, is essentially the distance between what the little learner can do by themselves and what the learner can do with adult guidance or collaboration. Now, obviously, in the case of college students, instead of little learners and adults, we're talking about adult learners and their instructors or people who have more experience or knowledge of the language. So when we think about scaffolding, scaffolding actually has to accomplish several things. First of all, scaffolding is what makes it possible for the learner to complete a task when they don't have the knowledge, the confidence, or the skill level to do that by themselves. So you can think of the zone of proximal development as something like this, where the scaffolding are the stepping stones that help us to cross this big swamp. But what we don't often think about is that for a competent, capable adult who has already got experience with whatever it is that we're scaffolding, walking across these stones would be no big deal. But for a beginning learner, those stones are quite irregular, for example. There's moss on the rocks that might cause them to slip. The space between the stones is not even. And those things are all really big challenges, particularly if you think about scaffolding for a small person. And the idea here is that we need to be thinking about whose definition of proximal we're using. Are we using ours, what's comfortable for us, or are we thinking about the smaller, tiny steps that a learner might need to take? So this is how teachers often think about scaffolding. We tend to want to explain the language. And so we give them formulas and we talk about all of the ins and outs of the grammar and then wonder why our students aren't successful. Here's how learners think about scaffolding. So you'll notice that there is no adult present in this picture. You'll notice that the learners are doing things, and you will notice that they are looking. So we can learn a lot from the Lego approach to scaffolding things. And here's one simple example. Here's a more complex example. So when you think about how Lego helps learners to complete a project, you'll notice that they are very explicit about a lot of things. They make the instructions visual, which gives access. It doesn't matter what language I speak. It doesn't matter how old I am. It doesn't matter if I have special needs. As a general rule, most people who engage with the instructions can see exactly what they're supposed to do. They use color to guide the attention of the learner, or in this case, the consumer. So you'll see that the colored arrows show what piece we're working with, and they show exactly where that piece is supposed to go. They keep the instructions simple and sequential, which allows learners to complete these things by themselves without additional help as a general rule. And they enable the learner to perform complex tasks because they are organized step by step. Lego also progressively structures content in the same way that we want to structure a project-based language learning experience. So they let the learners see what the overall goal is. They can see the finished product here. But then they show us how we move from, we see the whole product and then we focus on the individual parts, and then that takes us back to the whole product. We can look at known and move to the unknown. We can help learners move from simple to more complex, from concrete to abstract, and from meaning to form. So the idea, if you look at most really successful experiences designed for children, is that we focus on the play first, and then we teach the principles. We want to do the same thing in our language classes. So what layers of support might be needed in a project-based language learning context? It's not just the language. We have to provide cultural support in terms of the culture of the classroom, support in terms of the purposes of the learning and the context for the learning, support for the processes and the content, and support for the thinking. In other words, what we're trying to do is reduce the amount of mental effort that the learner's brain has to engage in order to process the content and produce the language. And that means that we need to remove irrelevant things. We're going to highlight key information. We're going to provide bite-sized chunks of content in consistent ways, and we're going to engage multiple senses as we do that. So in a project-based context, we're going to need to ask ourselves, what are students going to have to find out? Where are breakdowns likely? And what kinds of supports might our students need? So we're going to start with interpretive communication. Think a little bit about how we might scaffold texts. So when we're thinking about culturally authentic texts, we're thinking about texts that were produced within the target culture for members of the target culture. And it's important that we expose learners to those because there are so many cultural practices and perspectives embedded within those texts that are essential to developing high levels of communicative proficiency. So what kinds of texts can we use? We're going to look at a couple of examples here. So let's say that my textbook topic has something to do with health and hygiene. And the global issues that I want to connect that to are literacy and poverty. And the social problem that I'm going to be working on is the issue of healthcare within the cultural context of Honduras and the United States. And so my career pathways would be education and health science. So I might choose infographic type texts to start to help my learners gain information about some of the healthcare issues that somebody might face in that particular context. And so you'll see that in these texts, the one on the left is talking about how a person acquires this particular illness, that it comes from a mosquito bite and what the symptoms are. In the middle text, it talks a little bit about specific things that I can do to prevent this issue. And in the top text, I can learn more about the cycle of transmission. So you'll notice that I'm progressively moving in terms of proficiency from texts that don't require my learners to process a lot of words to texts that increase in complexity in terms of content and also in complexity in terms of language. You'll also notice that I'm using multiple texts and that these particular texts provide a lot of extra support in terms of visuals. Maybe we're going to look at a topic on weather or emergencies in my textbook. And so the global issue I'm going to connect that to is natural disasters. The social problem is emergency preparedness. The cultural context will be natural disasters in Spanish-speaking countries. And my career pathways that I might need to think about would be things like, how am I going to provide education? What about government and administration or public safety? So how can we help our communities become more prepared for natural disasters? So maybe some of my texts are going to include things like asking students to view video of natural disasters that was filmed in my target cultures. The text in the middle is a video where a public safety official is explaining to the public what they should do in the case of an earthquake. On the left, you can see newspaper reports that are culturally authentic of different types of weather disasters. And on the right, we might be looking at what kinds of products students might create, perhaps little informational vokies where they're explaining what people should do to become more prepared. So as we're thinking about our texts, we want to be looking for texts that will have some sort of personal relevance to our students, that have some kind of social significance and emotional impact. How do we find these texts? I'm going to let you digest this on your own, but essentially there are some really specific search tips that you can use to be more likely to encounter the search results that you need in the target language. I've also put a wiki together that contains a smattering of texts and also sources for advertisements, children's literature, documentaries, literary texts, informational texts in different languages and regarding different conceptual topics. So it might be a good place for you to start your search for culturally authentic texts. And we'll make sure that that link appears in the modules. I've also put together for you a couple of worksheets that will help guide your thinking as you are trying to determine what kinds of background knowledge will my students need, so that I can figure out then what kinds of texts I need to find in order to facilitate my project. This second worksheet will walk you through, if this is my project topic and this is my learning outcome, then what kinds of texts might I want to use, and how am I going to scaffold those texts? And the links at the bottom are 2 types of scaffolding that will be particularly useful to you in a project-based language learning context. So we're going to look at some examples of scaffolding now. And one of the first things we need to focus on is where breakdowns are going to occur. When we think about reading or listening or viewing in the target language, these are all the different places where things tend to break down. And rather than spend a lot of time on this slide, we're going to look at each of these separately in future slides here. So the first thing that we want to do in order to scaffold any kind of input for our learners is to think in terms of pre, during, and post activities. What are we going to have them do to prepare before they read or listen or view the text? What are we going to have them do during their reading or listening or viewing in order to interactively engage with the meaning and the form of the text? And what are we going to have them do after they read the text? We're also going to want to help them make multiple passes through the text for different purposes, because they will progressively acquire more information and understanding each time. And instead of changing the text, we want to change what we ask learners to do with the text so that it's developmentally appropriate for them. I will post in the modules a set of graphic organizers for you that talk about the purposes of pre, during, and post-reading activities, as well as a list of different types of pre, during, and post-reading activities that are hyperlinked to specific templates that you can use as you try these out with your own students. So, for example, if we're looking at video clips, in terms of making multiple passes through the text, in the first 30 seconds, I might want to identify the topic and help my students to make predictions about it, or have them identify the topic and make predictions about what's going to happen in the text as they're watching. The second time through the text, I'm going to let them watch the full clip. So the first time gets them accustomed to what they're going to experience and allows them to ask me questions if they have any. And then in the second pass through the text, I'm going to give them something specific to notice or to form an opinion about, so that their purposes for viewing are carefully guided. In the third viewing, I'm going to ask them to go back and analyze the video content or craft a personal response, or look at the video now only from the perspective of one of the characters, for example. We want to scaffold our project with multiple texts on the same topic from multiple perspectives, because this is part of how we build language in real life. So if you look at this particular set of texts, this happens to be a billboard in a subway, and each of the words is the same word, right? Trust. But we're looking at trust from the perspective of what it means to trust in the context of a barber's office versus a seeing eye dog versus in a relationship. And so as we look for texts for our projects, we want to be looking for multiple texts on the same topic or career pathway. We want to be looking for texts from multiple types of modalities, so things that students listen to, things that students watch, things that students read. And texts from multiple genres, so comic strips versus news reports versus magazine articles or short stories or poems. The more different genres and different types of texts we use on the same topic, the more likely it is that students are going to be able to increasingly expand their proficiency as they work with them, because the language and vocabulary about that topic is going to get recycled within each of those texts. We also want to look for texts that address the topic from different perspectives, both from different cultural perspectives, but also from different viewpoints on the topic. Memes are a really easy way to accomplish this. These aren't the best memes because I was looking for copyright safe ones, but you can go through and find whatever your topic is and start doing a search in your target language that's an image search, and search for the word meme, and you will find lots and lots of texts that can be used to progressively build students' understanding of the topic. So for example, with this activity, each time I flash a slide, students have to go find a new partner, and they talk about the slide with their partner, and I would provide some scaffolding, which I'll show you in a minute, for helping them to do that. And so by the time they've finished a 10 or 15-minute activity where they have been working through these different slides together and thinking about the different ways that people talk about beauty and think about beauty, then they're prepared to do some heavier reading or listening or viewing or producing in terms of that topic. We also want to make sure that we're asking them to edit the task and not the text, and that means providing smaller steps, giving more scaffolding for each step, and matching the task to the cognitive and developmental level of our students. So what does this look like in practice? What are some concrete things that you can do in order to accomplish this? As you look at these, if you happen to live in the United States, you probably are going to be able to recognize what product each of these things comes from. So for example, A is the A in all, B for Bubblicious Bubblegum, C for Campbell's, and so forth. M for M&M's, Q for Q-tips, R for Reese's. And so one of the things that I like this particular graphic for is that it really illustrates the mnemonic power of font and color. And we can use font and color and other visual formatting actions to guide students in knowing where to look. Often novices don't know what to pay attention to, and so we can help them to notice both important features of the language, but also to guide their thinking through a text by using these pieces. So let's look at how we might scaffold a text. So this is a text out of a magazine, and it's pretty overwhelming, even though it uses relatively simple language. I can scaffold by simply removing the distractions. So moving from lots of ads around it to removing the ads suddenly reduces the cognitive load for my learner. I can further scaffold by limiting the amount of text that I'm asking the learner to engage with. This particular one is nicely structured because it has specific headings and really small chunks of text. I can help scaffold by helping my learners to notice patterns in the text. So this particular Chinese text, you'll notice that the way the words or the characters are laid out makes it possible for me to start to see which characters are the same and how the sentence structure is basically repeating and then inserting a few new characters. So for those of you who don't speak Chinese, this text talks about how long seeds have long, long wishes and round seeds have round, round wishes, and so on and so forth. And so I was very excited because this was my first exposure to the idea that maybe I could actually successfully learn Chinese. I had a friend that was helping me to evaluate some culturally authentic texts for a workshop, and she was translating for me what things said. And after she had translated the page that came before this, I said, wait, stop, I think I can quote unquote read this next part of the text. Now, certainly I didn't know enough Chinese to read it in Chinese, but I understood the meaning of the characters because I could see the patterns. And you can lay out non-character-based languages in a similar fashion to help learners notice patterns. You can guide students' attention using color. So this was a poster that I was originally making many, many years ago in order to help students notice that there are certain verbs that have an irregular ending in the first person singular. But what I ended up noticing as I color-coded this was that it revealed for me the pattern or where the positive to commands come from in Spanish. Basically, it's what happens before the go. You can use technological tools to focus students' attention in a similar way. So if let's say I wanted students to focus on these three circled pieces of this newspaper article, I could go through and insert an image of this article into Prezi, which is a technological presentation tool. And Prezi allows you to zoom in and zoom out on various pieces of an image. And so I could use that tool to limit what students can see to only the circled part. We could accomplish whatever our task is with that circled part, and then I could zoom out. Other key issues included attending to genre. So genres are basically the organizational structure with specific linguistic features in a text. This would be an example of genre, and even if you don't speak the language, the target language here, it won't take you very long to figure out that this is probably a map, specifically a weather map, and you can probably even start to guess that some of the words are cities and some of the words refer to seas because of your pre-existing knowledge of the genre. If I think about fairy tales and the key characteristics of those, I know that fairy tales start with once upon a time. They talk about good and evil, or there's some sort of conflict between good and bad. There is a lot of repetition. Events occurs in threes, and there's usually a moral lesson. So if I know that as a student, that these are the characteristics of fairy tales in my particular target culture, then it positions me to understand the text better because I know what to expect in terms of the structure of the text, but it also prepares me to produce. So I might start in beginning level classes with simple activities that get my students paying attention to genre with guiding questions. And then I can use those activities to help students progressively gain more information from the text. So this is an activity developed by one of our participants from last year's project-based language learning Summer Institute. And she asked her students to quickly speed read to figure out what the genre is, then to go through and read more closely, looking for the main ideas, and then to read more critically further down the newspaper article for the details. So genre awareness can help our learners predict, comprehend, and produce information. Learners also make sense of text through the lens of their own knowledge and personal experiences. So when you look at all of these different texts in Arabic, your prior knowledge probably helps you to start figuring out what these are saying, even if you're not personally very familiar with the language itself, simply because you know about street signs and clocks, and you can predict what is probably on those computer keys. So we want to use that to our advantage. These are 5 key principles that you can use to scaffold interpretive inquiry for your students. We want to activate their prior knowledge and experiences, help them to build their background knowledge, create schema, or in other words, an organizational framework for them to organize the information that they're learning, help develop interactive tasks that engage them with the meaning of the texts. So we can have them use their prior knowledge and experiences by asking them to remember a time when something happened that is relevant to whatever it is that we're doing. By having them reflect on a situation or a quote, by asking them to analyze or evaluate something, or to do something based on something that they already know. We want to break the text into chunks. So a lot of instructors, particularly at the university level, feel this compulsion to require students to read the entire text. And instead, we might just pull out the abstract or a title or a paragraph that's particularly interesting and give students a choice between one paragraph and another, maybe put on either side of a card that sits in the middle of the table. And then we ask them to discuss those or to do something with those. We can help create schema by strengthening their conceptual understanding. So this happens to be some work with the text, The Little Prince, which is a culturally authentic text in French. In high school, when I taught high school, we had copies in French and in Spanish. And so we had our students reading this text in both languages. And I went to the French teacher and said, I don't know what a baobab is. I can't find it in any dictionary. And she laughed and she said, oh, it's a giant tree that generally grows in Africa. So I got online and started, this was kind of in the early days of the internet, so started exploring and realized that I could make this text, this chapter of the text, way more comprehensible for my students if I were to take an image from the textbook and images from online and have the chunk of text that matched the image go together on each of the pages. So these are two examples where when the text is saying that baobabs are not bushes, but trees as big as castles, I found a picture of a baobab that demonstrates what a tree that's as big as a castle might look like to help them to understand. And this does happen to be a baobab on the campus of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. You can ask students to make personal connections to the text. So there's a part in this same chapter where it talks about elephants eating up the whole baobab, grazing on it. And what I learned is that baobabs have hundreds of gallons of water in their bark, and so elephants do indeed graze on them. And then it talks about how if you don't get rid of baobabs when they're little, they create all sorts of problems. And so the picture on the left is a picture of a student who illustrated what kinds of baobabs there are in his life, gangsters and drug sellers in this particular case. We can use infographics to create schema. So this particular infographic talks about the qualities that are most sought after in a friend. It talks about the extent to which people trust their friends and different philosophical and religious viewpoints on friendship. So I might have students work with a partner to figure out what this says in preparation for a unit that is, or a project that's going to have something to do with friendship. We can create schema by having students make predictions, and you can use technological tools such as Tagxedo or Taggul to generate word clouds based on the frequency with which different words appear in the text, which also helps me as the teacher. We can create schema through interaction, experience, and relationships. And we can ask students to play with the content of text using interactive activities. So for example, I might use an activity called Grab a Word. The instructions are on the previous slide. And maybe I'm trying to help students differentiate between three different words that sound sort of similar or have similar parts to them. And so I'm going to give some kind of a clue, and then students are going to have to be the first one to grab that particular word. This is a task that a student teacher created, Janae Purcella, and she asked students to jump out of their seats each time they heard a particular word and to conjugate that verb. So she's focusing on form here as she's working with the preterite tense. I can have students matching text. So I provide the first half, and as they listen to a song or to a video, they are connecting the words so that they start to pay attention to what's there. And I can have them sequence texts as they listen. I also want to engage learners with meaning. And so I'm going to scaffold using multiple purposes for their reading. What do they need to find out? First, I'm going to ask learners to focus on the meaning of text. Then I'm going to have them make another pass where they're focused on linguistic forms or language patterns. And then in the third pass, I'm going to ask them to work through the text in the service of some sort of communicative activity. We're going to skip this one in the interest of time. The last piece that I want to highlight here is the idea of making multiple passes through the text for different purposes and how you can use the text itself to do that. So this particular article comes from Muy Interesante, and you'll notice that what's nice about this text is they've kind of scaffolded it for you already. They have gone through and bolded the main idea in each of the paragraphs. So I can have students go through and with a partner or by themselves read the main idea first, read the bold part of the text, and see if they can figure out what it means. You'll notice they've highlighted key vocabulary. So I can ask them maybe first, see if you can figure out what hormigas, dientes, humana, and insectos mean. Then I can have them read the bold text, and then I can have them go back and read for specific details. So you can have them doing multiple things with the text, and over time, as they do each of those activities, they progressively strengthen their understanding of the text. This is one of the ways they're also going to be able to build their academic language. And I want to just quickly end by highlighting a key tool called Newsela, which is mostly going to be useful for teachers who are teaching English or Spanish. It contains sets of texts on the same topics. So sets of texts about science or the politics of the United States or specific social problems, historical and social studies type topics, and there are multiple sets on each of the topics. So it makes it easy for you to find informational texts about those topics. But what's really nice is that they have the text organized by what are called lexile levels. So at the very lowest level, the text the text will show really simple language without a lot of connections. So for example, this text says, the inhabitants of Los Angeles are worried. A new type of mosquito has appeared on their patios. The name of the mosquito is the tigre asiático, and its bite can be dangerous. So the text is written in very simple language at the lowest level. But if you move up a level, then you start to get more sophisticated language. It starts off the same way. The inhabitants of Los Angeles have a problem, but then it goes on to talk about how this particular type of mosquito has invaded various zones in the state of California. This insect arrived for the first time in this particular way, and it moves on from there. So it provides additional detail. The sentences become more complex, and it uses more transitional words. You'll notice it also provides writing prompts and quizzes as well, which can be really useful if you happen to be able to find texts related to your project topic. Embedded reading is a way that you can make these texts on your own, and I've listed the website here so you can go explore more about that on your own. And then the last thing is that there is a set of materials that I have added to the modules, which give you a list of strategies for helping to build students' academic language, which will be particularly important as we think about scaffolding disciplinary content and content related to career pathways. So to summarize, we want to make sure that we activate students' prior knowledge and experiences, build their background knowledge about the topic, give them organizational structures to help them remember the information that they're reading or listening to or viewing, develop interactive tasks that let them actively engage with the content of the text, and engage them with the meaning in ways that let them talk about the content of the text. And that concludes this particular module. I've also added some additional supports in your modules for that are kind of a summary of these principles, a one-page handout on strategies that you can use to scaffold reading, and a planning menu that you can use for planning reading activities.